Welcome, everyone. My name is Adam Savitt. I'm Director of Communications at the Center for Security Policy. I'm pleased to welcome you back to the third installment of our voter education webinar series. We'll be holding these events every Wednesday at 1 p.m. right up through the election. Some weeks we will have an extra program, so be sure to check out the full schedule at securefreedom.org. Today's program is entitled An American Voter's Guide to National Security Issues 2020. Featuring my center colleague, Michael Waller, and guest, David Satter. Please note that you are in listen-only mode, but you can submit your text questions in the Q&A box on your GoToWebinar control panel, and I will read those questions at the end of the program. This event is being recorded and will be available on our YouTube channel, youtube.com/securefreedom, and on our website at securefreedom.org. With that, I'll hand it over to the Center's Senior Analyst for Strategy, Dr. J. Michael Waller.
Thanks, Adam. Hello, everybody. It's great to be here on this webinar on the main national security issues present during the 2020 campaign. Usually during presidential campaigns, national security doesn't loom very large, but this time with the Wuhan virus from China, with issues concerning Russia, with a whole lot of other things, national security is a big issue, and there are two very stark differences between the candidates. So this webinar today sort of knocks off a set of other ones that are going to discuss these various issues of national security and how the candidates are different from one another during this campaign. So there are 10 of them. You can find them on our website at securefreedom.org. But I think we're going to start right now with the way our whole national security debate during the Trump administration was framed. And that was Russia and this whole Russia collusion narrative that was put out and ultimately discredited. But we have with us today a guest who I've known a very long time, since our Reader's Digest days, and that's David Satter, who knows Russia better than anybody and longer than anybody around today. I rank him as a journalist up there with some of my heroes, Richard Pipes and Robert Conquest and others. So we're really excited to have David here. And I think, David, why don't we kick off on this national security question with what got the tone set in the 2016 campaign 4 years ago that has so distorted the way the country views national security issues today?
Well, I think that we're referring to the Steele dossier and the charges of collusion that were leveled against, at that time, candidate Donald Trump and then President Donald Trump. We still labor under those accusations, and it's nonetheless an issue, even though the accusations themselves have been discredited. I think that it's obviously convenient for the president's opponents to belabor this question. And what I've noticed is that none of those who were the most active in promoting the Russia collusion story and who put out a whole series of false reports, and this includes both journalistic organizations, news organizations, members of the intelligence community, members of Congress, have never really apologized for misleading the country for 2.5 years and basically inspiring the waste of millions of dollars, not to mention the kind of attention that was devoted to this. They've behaved as if they did nothing wrong, and have simply continued recycling to the extent possible the same accusations, this time without even the pretense of supporting evidence.
So this is much more than just Russia as a national security issue. This concerns the integrity of our intelligence community, where you have the CIA director under Obama was crucial to surfacing this narrative, but you have the FBI counterintelligence, the whole national security apparatus here that had become politicized or abused, or how do you see it in context with the Steele dossier?
Politicized, yes, but that in a way is less troubling than the fact that what our national security agencies demonstrated is that our government no longer has any real knowledge of Russia. The absence of expertise was the reason why the Trump dossier, or the Steele dossier, was taken seriously in the first place. Anyone reading that dossier would understand immediately, if he had any background, that this was a phony document. I got through the third or fourth paragraph, and it was perfectly clear to me when I read the text that was published by BuzzFeed that this is a Russian provocation, that we are now involved in a Russian active measure, and that this is intended not to favor one candidate or another, but to create chaos inside the United States, which is exactly what it did. I think that
Right
the
now,
Steele dossier.
you called that out. You called that out at the time because we didn't talk about it back then. But I remember seeing these allegations and thinking, this is disinformation because it's coming from entirely the wrong sources. It's coming from people who were always soft on the Kremlin, or some of them even doing business with the Kremlin, and from sort of lefties who never had a problem with Russian subversion before. But I didn't say anything because I thought, well, it's coming out of FBI and CIA leaks. It's interagency. It's not just one person. But you came out in what, January 2017. You were the first to call it for what it was. Can you explain?
Well, basically, because I'm now, unfortunately, one of the few people who has a direct experience of the Soviet Union. And the Soviet Union was the progenitor of these tactics. It was Russian intelligence is drawing on years of KGB experience in order to manipulate the situation in the US. But if you are not familiar with that experience, and if you haven't studied it, and if you're pretending to be an expert on a subject that you're not an expert in, obviously you're going to be easily misled. I personally would like to lay eyes on the genius who recommended Brennan to be director of Central Intelligence. It almost defies belief for me that we could have someone in that position who, with so little understanding of one of the most important national security issues facing the United States. I spoke at the CIA, by the way, in December 2016. I said all this before I wrote the National Review piece that you're referring to. But the Steele dossier was a transparent tissue of misrepresentation and lies. It embodied standard FSB KGB techniques of disinformation used to manipulate so-called American Russia experts and government officials for years. It should have been instantly recognizable. But instead, many of the people who themselves made careers out of being manipulated launched a wide-ranging campaign in the government, in the press, to call attention to this document and make it the basis for unfavorable stories, in the first instance about Trump, an FBI investigation, and of course continuing efforts at discreditation of other kinds. So
what we're seeing now, David, with the groundwork that you're laying here is for us to think about national security in terms of the election and beyond. You have poor quality analysis. You have a lack of a knowledge base in our intelligence community as analysts. I saw this as a graduate school professor with intelligence analysts and future analysts. Some of them were superb, and some of them you wonder how they could get a job as a custodian there. But you have this, it wasn't just me, you're finding this now system-wide, where the analysis is so poor that they see things where there is nothing to see, and they don't see things where there are. Is that correct?
They see what they're looking for, and they're under the influence of cronies whose true motivations they don't want to judge. Many of the people who were pushing the Steele dossier were those who had been hoping, and then after Trump won, were disappointed in their hopes. They were hoping to get positions in the administration. And by the way, this was not just an American phenomenon. The British were also involved. And I had repeated contacts with people in Britain whom I've known for decades, who demonstrated that they were hiding things about the dossier. One person who had a key role in handing the dossier over to David Kramer, who was Senator McCain's specialist on Russia, and in other respects is actually quite a good specialist. But nonetheless, this former British diplomat told me that he had no idea what was in the dossier. He just handed it over as a favor. Then I read his deposition, and it turns out he actively propagandized the dossier and was on the payroll of Steele's Orbis business investigations. One of the innumerable firms that pop up, staffed by former intelligence agents, that the Russians are well equipped to use as conduits for disinformation. I think that there was such antipathy toward Trump, and that combined with the lure of positions for many people that was represented by the Clinton campaign. It created, of course, and needless to say, the lack of real knowledge and information, it created very fertile ground for a Russian active measure. During the Soviet period, the Russians, or the Soviets at that time, used the German terrorists for their purposes in order to destabilize Western society. They provided them with money, logistical support when they needed to escape. When they were in danger of arrest, they could find safe haven in East Germany, but they didn't tell them what to do. They wanted partners, not subordinates. The German terrorists were free to do anything they liked. They were just friends to the terrorists, but they understood.
This is the Red Army faction.
Yeah, the Red Army faction. They understood that they didn't have to tell them what to do. They could of course channel the aid in a certain way, providing them with bullets instead of explosives, with making it easier for them to go after one target instead of another. They didn't tell them what to do. They wanted them to act on their own. And we had the same dynamic with the Steele dossier. They provided an obviously phony document. Ostensibly at the behest of the Democratic National Committee, knowing full well that document would not be read critically. And as soon as the Democrats got it, they were off to the races. There was no one who thought, well, wait a minute, does this really make sense? Should we take this uncritically? Isn't this from Russian sources? Should we really be paying the FSB for this kind of information? What if it's disinformation? Those questions were never asked.
So then, now most of the people involved in the analytical side, in the intelligence community and our counterintelligence people, they're still there. They're career people who are embedded in.
Mike, let's bear in mind one thing, that there are people, I am confident, at the staff level who were capable of understanding what was going on. I've seen this before in relations with Russia. After the WikiLeaks released the diplomatic cables that were stolen by the young recruit who became a woman.
Manning.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There were a lot of cables, including a fair number that talked about me. But I read the cables from the Moscow embassy, and although of course I definitely don't condone the leak of classified information in any way, nonetheless they made interesting reading simply because they showed that our rank and file diplomats were actually much better informed than I realized, and that their reporting was at a much higher level than I imagined. But I was operating on the basis of the finished policy, and I think there's some of that here too. I don't think that everybody at the CIA and in and FBI, other national security agencies, was necessarily taken in by this, but the people who are in a position to make decisions and who represented the leadership of those agencies, they were fooled completely, and to a certain extent they remain fooled insofar as they don't want to openly acknowledge their mistakes.
So building on this, and you'd be looking back at how this led to the impeachment of the President of the United States. And it was all done at the political level with malicious and or inept, or certainly aggressively malicious people on top, like Comey at the FBI and Peter Strzok, like Brennan at the CIA and others. And there was no consensus within the intelligence community about the nature of the Steele dossier and the allegations, correct?
Well, I think if the director of the CIA is thought to speak for his organization, then there was a consensus. I mean, he said that there's proof of collusion, and he didn't refer specifically to the Steele dossier, but it later transpired, and we have the Miller report to confirm this, that the Horowitz report, that the Steele dossier played a very important part in the investigation and in the accusations. What was going on at various other levels within the CIA is unfortunately something that we can guess about, but we don't have of course direct proof. Now the impeachment issue was actually separate from the issue of the Russian collusion, except insofar as the collusion investigation created the atmosphere in which there would be an attempt to impeach the president over the event, over the telephone call with Zelensky in Ukraine. But I think that these two issues need to be thought about separately. The one thing we can say, of course, is that an atmosphere was created which continues to exist to this day, which makes it hard for us to look at the policies pursued by the president objectively, which is what, of course, is required. To a certain extent, of course, he does not help that with his rhetoric, but nonetheless, as persons who are interested in national security, we also have an obligation to try to sort out, what exactly is happening here. In our developing our criteria for the National Security Voter Guide, we looked at Trump's and Biden's actual policies toward Russia, and we found that with Trump, it's more of look at what he does, don't listen to what he says, because what he does is often very different from the way he comes across in public. But you mentioned Ukraine, and I'd like to get into that a little bit too, because
for all the places in the world, Ukraine has never been a political issue before, and suddenly now it's a huge issue. Why do you think Ukraine is such an issue the way it is now, and such a bitter issue in the campaign? And you've got these Ukrainians from Ukraine sort of battling it out in Washington, and vice versa, and a lot of U.S. embassy and other people with strong roots in Ukraine. These are American government officials and former officials who all of a sudden now are turning Ukraine into a radioactive football during this campaign season.
Well, there's several issues here. Trump definitely used poor judgment in his conversation with Zelensky. There shouldn't be any hint that American aid is in any way dependent on actions taken against a potential American presidential candidate. And then, of course, as we know, Biden is now the candidate. The situation, nonetheless, that he was referring to is real, and we can get to that in a minute. What I think that people should understand is that Trump in this situation definitely deserved criticism, and he deserved to be rebuked. And it's something that he shouldn't repeat. What he did did not rise to the level of an impeachable offense by the standards that exist in our country, because something far worse was done by Obama when he told Dmitry Medvedev, who was the acting, really officially the president of Russia, in reality the acting president of Russia, sort of a seat warmer.
Putin's front man.
Yeah. When Obama told Putin, wait till the election to press, don't press us now on the issue of missiles in Europe. Wait until after the election, I'll have more flexibility. Well, that is a direct request to a foreign leader for help in the presidential election on an issue of national security.
And Medvedev said, "I'll relate that to Vlad," right? In that recording, he told Putin flat out,
I'm not sure what Medvedev's response was, but it doesn't much matter. Whatever the message was delivered. And by the way, this is not unusual. I mean, American politicians have often made the mistake of assuming that Russians can be their allies in their fight with the other party in the U.S. And the Russians have encouraged that. Henry Kissinger used to complain to Anatoly Dobrynin about his problems with Congress, as if Dobrynin was part of a democratic government. So
this was Leonid Brezhnev's foreign minister, a very long time foreign minister.
No, he was the ambassador. He was the ambassador to the United States. Yeah.
He was there so long. He was institutional.
Oh, he was there so long. He was practically part of the woodwork. But of course, the animosity toward Trump is such, and was such, that this was treated as an impeachable offense, when in fact it was definitely not the right thing to do. It was relatively minor against the background of some of the things that have been done.
Yeah, so why would Ukraine be such a national security issue now? Why is this really vicious fighting over, of all places, Ukraine?
Well, there are a couple of issues here. For one thing, and I believe it's going to be raised again. Joe Biden's son Hunter was on the board of a corrupt Ukrainian gas company at the time that Biden was in charge of the effort to curtail corruption in Ukraine. Now, when this of course tempted the Republicans to make this an issue, and it's a legitimate issue because in countries like Russia and Ukraine, when a foreigner is charged with a dossier like anti-corruption and then puts his son or allows his son to be on the board of directors of one of the nation's most corrupt organizations, people immediately assume that anything that the father says regarding corruption is just empty words and doesn't have to be treated seriously. And that was the reaction, of course, in Ukraine. I think once again, you talk about the animosity. Well, we saw various people said these are the soldiers who are dying because of Trump, ignoring the fact that there was never any break in the delivery of arms. That in fact the arms that had been delivered were stockpiled because the nature of the fighting on the line of contact had changed.
This is Ukrainian forces fighting the Russian forces, Ukrainian troops. Yeah.
The separatist forces fighting the Russian forces, but with the help of with the concealed help of the Russian military. At this and in fact what Trump's actions had no effect on the situation on the battlefield. But what made the situation truly grotesque, I think, was the fact that many of these people who are making these charges found no problem when, during a period in which thousands were being killed, the Obama administration refused to deliver the anti-tank weapons that the Trump administration approved. So, we have entered in our political discussion of Russia and Ukraine into a sphere of false information inspired not by any kind of expertise and objectivity, but on the contrary, by the emotions, ambitions, and corruption of the people who are engaged in the debate. And that is very dangerous because Russia in particular, Ukraine for different reasons, those are important countries. And we are, one of the things that we ought to concentrate on, if Trump is reelected, one of the things that he needs to concentrate on is the importance of words in dealing with these countries, because contrary to what a businessman might think, and Trump is a businessman, in dealing with Russia, words do matter because the Russian population is effectively silenced and they look to the outside world. But the kind of debate that we are having right now in the United States is no good to them. It's no good to us, and it's no good to anyone else. And it seems in some ways, I occasionally feel that it's spiraling downward. That since we have directors of Central Intelligence, we have heads of congressional intelligence committees, we have major newspapers who don't think that telling the truth and being rigorous about facts is their obligation. And obviously, that's going to affect the ability of the United States to exert world leadership.
Yeah. Now, how do you, putting all of that in context, all the corruption and manipulation of opinion and using politicians and family members or business interests to further goals for people in other countries like Russia or even Americans here at home, how would you apply all this to China in terms of national security and the Chinese Communist Party's influence on how we think and how we act in this country?
Well, I hesitate to talk too much about China because I've devoted my life to studying Russia and the former Soviet Union. The one link, of course, is that China is a communist country, although it has a capitalist economic system. It's certainly run by a communist party, and the China's past is absolutely horrific, even by communist standards. We can take some lessons from the experience of the Soviet Union about the importance of not taking these countries at their word and insisting on things we can verify, and not giving in to illusions vis-a-vis their intentions, or a country that's ready to slaughter its own people, as the Chinese did in Tiananmen Square, is ready to commit other atrocities if that's what's required in order to stay in power. And we always ought to have that in mind. We ought to have that in mind in the case of Russia.
And what we've done here at the center is to look at a lot of Chinese subversive activity here by the Communist Party, but through American outlets, whether they're think tanks, some of which we all know very well, that take Chinese associated money, whether it's from American companies or Chinese individuals, and other policy groups and companies whose bottom line depends a lot on pleasing the Chinese Communist Party. But we found that working our knowledge of how the communists did it in the Soviet times and applying it in a more modern, high-tech, and very different Chinese way, found a lot of similarities there on how the Chinese Communist Party is able very much to influence American politicians, cultural leaders, business leaders here in the U.S. and education.
Well, it was one school. They all went, they were all part of the Comintern. That was the Organization of International Communist Parties. They all had the same instructors. They had the same. They all came, many of them, at least their predecessors studied in Moscow. The point is that communist ideology was a formula for undermining the fundamentals of the Western world. It denied. It's an entire interpretation of reality that leaves out the one element that is critical in Western thought, which is the idea of a transcendent source of legitimacy. Under these circumstances, people who are heirs to the West, who recognize the rule of law, recognize ethical and moral limits, need to be aware that there's a whole psychology and system that operates without the benefit of that kind of moral guidance. For that reason, one of the things that has disappointed me about the Trump administration has been the failure, and of course this occurred under Obama, but nonetheless, Trump has the option of making an issue something that was previously ignored, was the reaction to the shooting down of the MH17 Malaysian airliner. 300 people were killed. I'm an expert witness in the case that's been filed by the relatives of the victims against Russia in the European Court of Human Rights. And I'm quite convinced that passenger plane was shot down deliberately. At the time, the Ukrainian army was making rapid progress in defeating the separatists and driving them out of Ukrainian territory. Once the plane was shot down, the conflict became internationalized. Western powers said, well, this is threatening to get out of hand. We have to intervene. They brought enormous pressure to bear on Ukraine. And that, in combination with a naked Russian offensive carried out by Russian troops, was sufficient to engineer the present stalemate. But this issue is not treated as important even though it far exceeds in importance everything that we're talking about. There are other issues that were ignored. For example, the murder of Boris Nemtsov, the leader of the Russian opposition, and actually a potentially more effective leader than Alexei Navalny and more pro-Western. We need really to get our priorities right in dealing with Russia and understand the kind of country it is and the kind of system that gave birth to present-day Russia and that still shapes it. And we don't do a very good job of that because they keep us occupied with our internal fighting. One of the reasons why they're so anxious to carry out operations like the Steele dossier is to make sure that we don't pay too close attention to what they're doing at home, to their own people and potentially to us. There was an American on board MH17. And on the principle that a good offense is the best defense, they know they're corrupt. They know that there's a small group of people in Russia that is dominating the country and stealing as if there's no tomorrow. They fear their own people, and for them, and they know they're incompatible with the institutions of the West. And for them, what matters is to make sure that the Americans think that the most important conflict in the world is the war between Republicans and Democrats, and that they forget what they have in common, and that they end up perpetually at each other's throats. And
so they're good at
no, they're excellent. They're excellent. They're excellent. They just drop. It reminds me of a story that from Ukraine. From actually the Kuban, which is an area not far from Ukraine, the Krasnodar Oblast. There were two families that were bitter enemies, and were quarreling over property, and a third group wanted to get the property. So they one of the families was having a big wedding, and they threw a black cat over the fence in the middle of the wedding party. Well, Russians are very superstitious, and that, of course, threw the entire wedding into chaos. And the victimized family blamed their antagonists, and there was a massive shootout. And the people who threw the black cat into the wedding ended up taking all the property. So it's a little bit like that. I mean, the Steele dossier was a black cat that they threw into our wedding, and set the pro and anti-Trump people, the Democrats and Republicans, against each other. And the people who benefited, of course, were those who want nothing but ill for our country. We're
finding a similar black cat thrown into our politics on China, because I mean, after any other national emergency like 9/11, you'd have the country at least briefly united around the president, and certainly not assaulting the president until we can get back on our feet and see where we're headed as a nation. But in this case, with the outbreak of the pandemic in the United States, you had Chinese Communist Party publications where you can follow the official party line, but they're saying we have to get people to stop blaming us. We have to push the blame onto other people and push the blame to Trump. And right away, you had, starting in January, when President Trump imposed the travel restrictions on China to keep the virus from spreading here. January 31st, Joe Biden came out and said it was xenophobic and a terrible thing to do. And Nancy Pelosi issued a press statement calling it hateful and vile and racist and everything else, rather than say we all need to stand together and to fight this virus as a nation.
Well, that
immediately blame Trump.
Mike, even without the Chinese, I mean, I'm sure that they were happy to see that, and maybe they contributed. I don't know that, what went on there. But the atmosphere in the country right now, here's the thing that people, I think, need to keep in mind. Mikhail Gorbachev in 1988 made a statement that registered with me. I never forgot it. He said, "We're going to do a terrible thing to you. We're going to deprive you of an enemy." And when the Cold War ended, when the global challenge of communism forced people to look outward, it forced them to think in terms of ideas. When that disappeared, the attention of the United States turned inward, and issues that would never have been regarded as significant, or at least, I mean, worthy of emotion, came to dominate the political space. You know, if you'll read some of the statements that are being made, and in particular, David Axelrod had a piece on CNN in which he talked about the disaster that's going to befall the country if Trump is reelected. And he listed no progress on climate change, heightening of gender inequality, unfair economic policies, and so on and so forth. Well, we've been discussing, restrictions on abortion he might have included, but we've been discussing those issues, for decades, and they were never considered to be the most important or even significant political issues. They were the things that people tried to work out within the framework of a democratic society. Now, with the disappearance of what was a fundamental threat to the West, we start taking issues that are conditional and treat them as fundamental. That's one, and that has, because people are looking for also for an outlet for their energy. Trump comes along, and because of his manner, because of his lack of caution in the way he speaks, and also, but most important, because of his readiness, to point out just how meaningless a lot of these issues are, has evoked enormous hostility toward himself. But and he's, the conflict in American society has become, even dangerous. But the core of it is that we don't have something deep to think about anymore. We're not, without a tangible threat, we don't want to think about the questions that have troubled people for centuries: the source of values, the meaning of the West, why our institutions are important, why they have to be preserved. Those things are not important. What's important is how are we going to affect the climate, if indeed we can affect the climate. I don't know if we can.
And wreck our own institutions in the process.
The process, that's the point.
Now, there are still existential threats to us here, because a lot of even supporters of the president, many of them say, well, Russia's not the Soviet Union anymore. It's not so much of a threat. But looking over the past 30 years, they've, with our aid, even managed to build up a qualitative and quantitative advantage with a brand new strategic nuclear missile force. Can you talk about that at all?
Well, yeah, they because they, unlike us, they don't worry about the welfare of their soldiers. They don't spend money the way we do. They concentrated on those things that they think they can use to threaten the world. But the fact is that isn't even the real danger from Russia, in my opinion. The real danger is that the structure of power in Russia is unstable. You cannot rule, even as the protests in Belarus show, nobody can stay in power forever. And they have very little choice but to stay in power forever. I mean, Putin came to power as the result of a crime. a terrorist act. That's the blowing up of the apartment buildings in 1999. Now, I have dealt with this issue for more than 20 years. The evidence is overwhelming and incontrovertible that those bombings were carried out by Russian intelligence itself in order to bring Putin to power.
Step back a little bit, David, because this was a long time ago for many of our viewers, and they might not even be aware of these bombings of these apartment buildings and what was discovered, and in fact, your own work in getting right down there and discovering exactly what happened.
Well, what happened was this. Yeltsin was finishing his presidential term. He had a 2% popularity rating. And some people doubted he even had 2%. And there seemed to be no possibility that anyone connected with him could be elected president. Yet on September 8th, he had a meeting with Bill Clinton, and he told President Clinton that this is my successor, Vladimir Putin. You're going to find him very easy to work with. You should give him your support. Hard to understand how he could have been so confident, but on September 9th, an apartment building in 1999, apartment building in Moscow was blown up in the middle of the night. Apartment buildings began to be blown up in other Russian cities. The result was that the Russians accused Chechen separatists of planting the bombs. No Chechen was ever found to be connected to those bombings, but they began an invasion of Chechnya, supposedly in response, and Putin was put in charge, and Putin's popularity rose, and he was elected president. Then a fifth bomb was discovered in the basement of a building in the city of Ryazan, and the people who put the bomb in the building were caught, and they produced FSB identification. Well, the head of the FSB said that this was a training exercise, but the bomb was a real bomb. It had
Putin's successor was head of
it had a live detonator.
Yeah.
And it matched all the other bombs that had gone off successfully, killing hundreds of people. This was buried, and anyone who tried to investigate this was killed. A whole lot. In fact, one of the reasons that Alexander Litvinenko was poisoned in London was because he attempted to investigate and expose what happened in 1999.
And this is what we're dealing with today. We've got a lot of questions here.
What we're dealing with today to bring us to the present day. There's a long train of crimes, beginning with the apartment bombings, including, our silence about the apartment bombings. And I made a Freedom of Information request and I got documents from the State Department that showed that State Department informants explained to our people in Moscow that those bombings were highly suspicious. When Madeleine Albright was asked at the Senate, in the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, whether there was any evidence that the Chechens were responsible, she said no. So then when she was asked, well, then who was responsible? She said, we are opposed to terrorism in all its forms. Mrs.
Well, now we gotta just to wrap that up, because we have a lot of questions from viewers waiting for us. But the nutshell is Putin's a guy who took power by blowing up his own citizens in apartment disasters to create a situation where only he could come to the rescue to save the country from a decrepit Yeltsin and bring order back, right?
Basically, yeah. This was a planned. I'm convinced, and I believe that the evidence incontrovertibly shows that Putin came to power through an act of terror against his own people. But what will happen when his hold on power weakens? And why is it that we're so surprised about the behavior that followed from that?
Yeah.
The-
Well, Adam, you've got some questions here. I've got a lot of questions of you, David, right now, but I'd like to hear from our viewers.
Yes, we do. You pointed out that the Russians are more interested in causing chaos in our electoral system than getting one candidate elected over another. What steps can we take now, given the realities of the personalities in both parties, to frustrate this Russian design?
I mean, is the question that is there something now that would make them prefer one candidate over another?
No, I think it's given that they don't really care who wins, what can we do in general to thwart the interference?
To prevent their interference.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, I see now. First thing to bear in mind is that their interference has the effect of their interference, their hacking activities, their activities in the social media, has been exaggerated. Where they really have had an effect is in getting Western politicians to accuse each other. Russia does not have the expertise or the ability to influence an American presidential election. The most they cannot say anything that the various sides are not already saying. And their knowledge of the subtleties of the American political competition is not that great. I mean, they too are culture bound to a certain extent. In order to prevent that, it's true that Trump could be more resolute in his protests over whatever interference we discover. But at the same time, I honestly think that is not really a very important issue. The Russians did not invest a lot of money in it. There was the effect in the 2016 election was of what they actually did was minimal as opposed to the content of what was revealed. Obviously, we don't want Russians working as investigative reporters. The most significant thing in 2016, of course, were the WikiLeaks revelations about Clinton. I mean, if they had been published by an investigative journalist, that would have been worthy of the Pulitzer Prize. And we don't want Russians using their hacking abilities in order to unearth things that should be unearthed by our own journalists. But all of this has to be put into some sort of perspective. It's for Americans. Americans still have the ability to win or lose an election. What the Russians can do is take the people who are contesting an election and turn them into bitter enemies, and make sure that the election is carried out at the lowest possible level. And that's what they've been able to do.
How could the transcript of the Trump discussion with Ukraine get to Schiff without Brennan and his internal spies not being part of it?
I don't know that. The fact is, I mean, we know that the normal sense of responsibility and the ethical obligations of national security officials are being ignored. We see it by the scale of the leaks, and the disregard for the possible national security consequences, because people around the world when they consider cooperating with the United States, and we depend on a flow of vital information from informants all over the world, often from people in very dangerous situations, they have to take into account that somebody in the national security apparatus is going to consider it in his interest or consider it in the interest of the nation to reveal information that could put him in danger. Why should he cooperate under those circumstances? So, I mean, I don't know where how, what the path was for that information, but there could have been a lot of paths, because we see the kind of behavior that has become very widespread.
So this viewer agrees with you generally about the Russian collusion issue, but he's still questioning, why doesn't the president call out Putin for aggression against Ukraine, poisoning of Navalny? For example, why doesn't he value NATO and access to European bases, even if some of the allies aren't meeting their obligations, et cetera?
Well, there are a lot of points there.
Yeah.
I think that on the NATO question, my feeling about Trump's actions is that by and large, if we exclude his said things, first of all, we need to say that there is a basis for being suspicious of Trump, which he created himself. Choosing Carter Page during the campaign as a Russian policy advisor was practically unbelievable, even by the standards of the fairly low bar for choosing advisors who are often chosen on the basis of Russian specialists who are often really just presidential cronies. But Page immediately began repeating Russian propaganda. And then Trump in February 2017, when he came into office, said, well, in response to statements about Russian crimes, said, well, we kill people too. No American president has, with all of the stupid things that American presidents have said about Russia, none had gone that far. Now, to Trump's credit, he didn't repeat the mistake, but he continues to be unjustifiably effusive in his attitude toward Putin, which sends exactly the wrong signal to the Russian people and to our allies. Now, on the other hand, when it comes down to his actions have been very prudent. First of all, he agreed to the delivery of anti-tank weapons to Ukraine. I mean, the Ukrainian forces were being devastated by mass tank attacks by the separatist Russian side. Now that the nature of the conflict has changed. Now it's mostly sniper warfare, but those anti-tank weapons are in Ukraine, and they are a deterrent. Trump has insulted NATO, but the NATO countries, and he's insisted on a larger contribution from NATO countries. But in fact, he's gotten it to a certain extent, and the result is that NATO has gotten stronger. I've forgotten what some of the other points that your questioner raised were, but Trump's definitely, if he is reelected, needs to change his rhetoric toward Russia for the sake of our country and for his own sake, because it will get him nowhere. It gives undeserved legitimacy to Putin, and it really shakes the confidence of people who need to rely on us. But if we look at the record of how Trump, for example, in Syria in February 2018, when a group of Russian mercenaries attacked U.S.-supported Syrian forces, the U.S. reacted forcefully, and I believe, I mean, there are various reports of how many people were killed, but there were mass casualties. an attempt like that to violate a demarcation agreement with impunity had not been repeated. So there are many things. I mean, if you know the thing is that the reading public, the ordinary American citizen, is not familiar with the details of U.S.-Russian relations, but he does see the way Trump behaves when he meets with Putin, and he does hear the things that Trump says. I mean, the irony is that many of the people who were the most willing to accommodate Putin are now posing as Trump critics. But I think these are their career interests that are at stake more than anything else. Was there anything I've forgotten? Were there any other points that our questioner raised aside from NATO, Ukraine? What else was there?
Maybe we want to move. Maybe Mike, just one more question.
Yeah, sure.
So any thoughts on Russia's role in what's happening in Belarus? And of course, that's a disputed election with unrest, which hopefully we don't have here. But is Russia?
Yeah, well, of course, we definitely hope we don't have anything like that here, and I don't think we will. I mean, because, but as far as the Russian reaction, I mean, they've been relatively cautious. Putin understands that he could be sitting on a volcano, and he's even the question of getting involved in Belarus. Even in the case of Ukraine, he didn't. The Russians, for the most part, tried to use native separatists. Well, he doesn't have a group like that in Belarus. Russian intervention might very well face the resistance of the entire country, and so he's behaving cautiously, giving support to Lukashenko, but not making the kind of overt moves that would and trusting Lukashenko to keep the situation under control. Whether Lukashenko will be able to do so is another thing.
All right, let's leave it there.
Yeah, I mean.
Great. Well, thank you, Adam. Thank you for your questions out there, David. I'd just like to wrap up with one thought because of what's going on now and what we're expecting to see in this country in the next few weeks. Earlier on in this discussion, you talked about the East Germans and the Soviets using West German terrorist groups and letting them have sanctuary in the Soviet bloc and not necessarily controlling them as agents or telling them what to do, but letting them do whatever they needed to do to sow chaos. The German Verfassungsschutz, which is the office of their interior ministry that protects the Constitution and watches extremist groups, has come out recently and said that they see things getting a lot worse in the Antifa network of Germany. It looks like they can see terrorist structures starting to form. And then you had the daughter of Ulrike Meinhof of the old Red Army faction of the 80s came out in a Swiss publication earlier this year and said that the current German Antifa movement has a lot of the hallmarks of her mother's old Baader-Meinhof gang. What do you see from a Russia perspective? Do you see Putin manipulating this at all against both NATO, not just both, but NATO, the US, Canada, certain South American countries, or is this something different?
Well, I think it has roots here. I mean, Russia manipulates it indirectly by helping to create the animosity in American society. But it isn't Russia that created the kind of politically correct worldview that is fostered in our universities. And it isn't Russia that, has undermined the integrity of the American press. I mean, those factors which really have damaged the atmosphere in society, I think, are the real seedbed for groups like Antifa. The inability to think, the unwillingness to think, the lack of an education, the lack of any kind of perspective or knowledge of the outside world. You know, to the degree the Russians may watch this and say that they really don't have to do a great deal. I would not be surprised if there were, you know, in some specific situations, or if in the future they were to decide to try to influence what's going on. But in the case of the Badr Manhaf gang and the Red Army faction, they were dealing with people who considered themselves communists, whereas these groups are, you know, they don't even, in terms of intellect, they don't even rise to that level. So I mean, you know, for the Russians, it would be hard place to figure out how to influence people who in many ways are so primitive. But of course, you know, if the opportunity arises, it wouldn't surprise me if they did.
Great. David Satter, thanks for joining us here at the Center for Security Policy. Next week to our viewers, I mean, I could go on all day with you, but we're limited in time here, but thanks so much.
Thank you.
For our viewers, this was unrehearsed. We didn't talk about the issues that we were going to discuss, so I had no idea what David's answers would be. And but thank you for joining us. And next week we have, we're going to talk about China. On September 23rd, we're going to have two great guests, Jeff Nyquist and Sam Faddis. So please join us then this time next week on September 23rd. Thanks again. David, thank you too.
Thank you, Mike.